7 days from the surgery, I experienced an inner click. It was extremely clear that in that instant of that click, that the animating life force in this body was beginning to drain away. I was able to recognize that there was this awareness, that non-corporeal sense of self was dissolving. It was itself beginning to diffuse, to dissolve into the absolute allness, or dissolve into the infinite. As every molecule of life force fell away, there was an equal and growing experience of merging into the infinite. So in that moment in which fear was essentially impossible, the only default setting was simply something loving, a complete release from fear of any kind, and which seems to contain absolutely everything and all in an infinite manner, without any lack, want, or need, which sounds suspiciously like what a lot of religions describe as heaven.
The A.J. Parr Spiritual Journalist Podcast.
We are here with Jonathan Van Valin. He had an amazing near-death experience at the age of 29. Welcome, Jonathan.
Thank you, AJ. It's nice to be here.
Can we start out talking about this experience, when it happened and how?
It took place at the age of 29. It was 7 days after I had undergone a surgical procedure. I had been in the hospital for 4 of those days. I had then been released into the care of my father, who had opted to watch over me. And there wasn't much he could do. The surgery was for a sleep apnea issue. So they removed a great deal of tissue from the back of my throat, and even a few chips of bone from the skull behind my nose. And the net result of that is a couple things. It just makes all those spaces bigger, which is what was important. But it's a surgery that's rarely done these days because it's known for being an exceptionally painful recovery, among other reasons as well. And so the 7 days from the surgery had been an experience of just physical pain it's hard to put into context, really. It's just mind-bending pain. And the reason for that is that you have to continue to use this very, very nerve-rich part of your body. You have to breathe and swallow and things like that. And so the analogy given me by the docs at the time was that I was going to have to see what it was like to break my femur and then have to walk on it for days. And that was a very colorful but apt. It was very accurate, very, very painful. And I mention it only because of what happened in the NDE. So one of the other factors that it's odd that this wasn't more accounted for, but sometimes, it's another issue. But sometimes this is healthcare in America, where I've been sort of booted out of the hospital after 4 days, barely able to function. And 3 days into my father's care, I experienced an inner click. That's the best way for me to describe it. That's the way I perceived it. Inside my mind, there was this inner click that caught my attention, and immediately it was extremely clear that in that instant of that click, that the animating life force in this body was beginning to drain away. My body was beginning to die. And in the same instant of that click, there were 3 recognitions that sort of flooded in simultaneously. The first of those recognitions was so startling to me, and it was simply that I wasn't my body, and that it was, as the way I would describe it, was that I was able to recognize that there was this awareness, this aware consciousness, that although I had always associated it with my body, it was in this instant very clear that it had never really been contained by this body. And the reason that was so confounding and remarkable and extraordinary and freeing in that moment was that what it meant more than anything in that moment was that if I wasn't my body, I also needn't attach to the pain that was in that body. And so it was a complete freedom from the suffering of it. And it was the first time, not the last, that I saw this clear difference between pain and suffering, that those could be 2 different things. And I would wish to be clear about that. It's not as though the pain in that body all of a sudden disappeared. It did not. It was as present as ever, and blackout level, mind-numbing pain. But I didn't have to tell a story about it. I didn't have to attach to it. I didn't have to own it. It was as though the pain could be let be, but I didn't have to suffer it. And so, certainly after days of this, you can begin to imagine, what a relief and what a freedom was contained in that. It was also true that in that moment, I recognized that that life force in me was draining away relatively slowly, and that it was going to take some time. And the revelation of not being my body was already such a well, it was just so extraordinary. I wish I had better words for it, more descriptive words, but it was a way of experiencing that was so different than the usual framework that it was absolutely extraordinary. And the fact that my body was going to be dying, at least at this point, slowly, came as the thought that followed it was wow. It seems like I'm going to be able to experience this for quite a while. This is going to be fascinating. And so it was met with this sort of curiosity. And, well, we'll move right into the third. I didn't know how long I'd have. It appeared, at least at that time, it appeared as though I'd have at least a few days. And that was met with fascination. But the third thing that flooded in kind of blows them both away, which was that, and I have to go back to the first of them, which was, again, there's this aware beingness that clearly was not the body. And again, it was a sense of self, like I have a sense of self. It's separate from the body. It can observe the body, but it is itself not the body, but still a sense of self. But in this third sort of revelation, what was seen is that even that non-corporeal sense of self was dissolving. It was itself beginning to diffuse, to dissolve into what is difficult to describe, but it's why I used words like dissolve into the absolute allness or dissolve into the infinite. It was beginning to lose its individuality. And but what that favored, what that was dissolving into, was this absolutely all-encompassing, infinite all. And there's a lot to unpack there. But what I would stress more than anything is that there could not have been any sense of loss in that in any way whatsoever. That if something is contains absolutely everything and is absolutely infinite in its wholeness, then it cannot be missing anything.
What did you feel exactly as you were dissolving?
The literal experience, the literal feeling of it, first of all, was that as every molecule of life force fell away, there was an equal and growing experience of merging into the infinite. But again, that infinite contains absolutely everything, which includes all the memories I've ever had, all the experiences I've ever had. And so there was no sense of loss of any of that. It's more of a simple sense of gaining everything at the expense of nothing.
While this was happening, what were your eyes seeing, or what did you perceive regarding your surroundings?
That's a very good question. I'm glad you asked it, because that's also a situation where the most literal perception was not really changing. Like, did it appear as though I was sensing my world out of these two oculuses as usual? Yes, it did. And I'm glad you asked, because that it begs the question of out of body experiences. And I want to be a bit subtle about that, because in that, certainly, especially in that first sort of moment of revelation in which I felt, I recognized that I, as a some kind of being, aware consciousness, was not my body. And in the sort of typical experience of an out of body experience, which was something I would have later myself, so I feel like I could relate to it very well. There's so often this experience of like, well, my awareness, my frame of reference for perception is over here, my body is over there, and those are equally valid, things. Like the body is a real thing over here, my perceptual self is over here, perceiving what's over there. And that is not what was taking place here. What was taking place was the recognition and awareness that the body that had this illusory quality to it. And it was seen that well, if something is an illusion, it doesn't have real reality. It doesn't have realness. It is a figment. It's an illusion. And so if something isn't fundamentally real in the first place, it doesn't and cannot contain anything in a real sense. And so in the body was seen in that illusory capacity. And so it was understood and experienced that the fact is that this body had never contained that consciousness. It had appeared to, it had seemed like it, but when recognized for the illusion that was, it's released from it. It's why the pain in that body made no difference whatsoever. The pain in that body could not possibly render that aware consciousness, or let me flip it around, that aware consciousness couldn't be impugned or couldn't be meaningfully affected by anything going on in that body. And so, again, that's why it's completely released from the suffering of it. So, yes, the perception is sort of out of the usual oculus. And by extension, if the body itself was seen as sort of an illusory construct, the fact is that everything in this three dimensions, this four-dimensional time space, was seen to be of a essentially similar illusory quality to it. And so there was nothing in this dimension that could affect the absolutely overwhelming peace that these experiences afforded. So being freed from the body and having this experience of merging into the vastness, into the infinite, overall was an experience of such overwhelming peace that even the horrendous pain in that body could not disturb that peace. Nor could the idea that that body was dying disturb the overwhelming peace. And that's why, it's because of that when my father came into the room a little later, and again, practically speaking, there wasn't really much he could do for me other than, see if I'm sitting up straight and staring out a window or something. There really wasn't much he could do to care for me in this recovery. And when he comes into the room and has a look, and he's sort of banging around the house and the property, doing chores and whatever he's doing, there's not remotely even an impulse in me to say there's an issue, because I'm not experiencing any of this as a problem. How could I? It is, to quote a popular source, being steeped in the peace that passes all understanding. And I knew that it passed my understanding to the point that there's no way I could explain myself in that moment to my father. It's also true that just, the physical uh, uh, limitations of the surgery were so I could barely talk at all, even if I wanted to in this particular moment, but there was no impulse to do so. There was certainly no impulse to communicate that my body had begun to shut down and to die, because it could not possibly have been seen as a problem. If one is merging into absolute allness, in which there could not possibly be anything missing, then it's impossible to see that there is something that's broken. There isn't. There's no possibility for there to seem like there's some kind of lack or want or need. There wasn't any sense of those things. And it's in that sense that there couldn't possibly be any sense of fear. None. So there's no way to communicate that there was a problem. It was irrelevant. It didn't even occur as a thought pattern. In my experience, you could say it was an overwhelming awareness of absolute awe.
How long did this experience last? Was it something momentary, or did it last, for a long time?
It was not momentary at all. It began with the moment of that inner click and lasted through the entire rest of the day, throughout the night, and into the following day. And it was in that following day, in the afternoon, that my father said, I think we better go back to the hospital. And so this is an experience that lasted collectively very fully throughout basically 2 full days. This was the state of mind that I spent the next few days in.
Wow. What were the consequences? Did this change your life in some way?
It took a while for those changes to take root. Yes, I mean, it blew synapses in my mind, like it blew my mind. But, like I said, initially when my father came in the room for the first time, I said absolutely nothing to him. I couldn't imagine. I could not possibly fathom how to put into words to my father that my body and myself were two different things, and one of them was basically irrelevant. And I know my father well enough to know that there's no way I can convey this experience to him in a way that he will find meaningfully understandable. There's also still, like I said, there's no impulse to even describe it in the first place. There's nothing in me that needs to say it. That would imply that there was, in fact, some kind of a lack or a want or a need. There simply was not. So when he comes in the room, I smile at him. And, many of the people listening to this will recognize a phrase from some other source in their life that says something like, love is the opposite of fear. And so in that moment in which fear was essentially impossible, the only default setting was simply something loving. So all I did was smile at him and feel loving towards him and say absolutely nothing. And that is how things went for the next couple of days until it was actually late in the afternoon on the following day when he has come into the room yet again and check, how's he doing? And this time I see his face squinch up and he looks at me funny and he looks right close and he just says, Jonathan, I think something's not right. I think we better load up the car and head back over to the hospital. And that's a 2-hour drive away. We're way out in the countryside. And so during that second day, one of the occurrences was that there did come a moment in which it was clear that, first of all, the life force in me is draining away faster. My body is really shutting down quite a bit more quickly. It's very obvious to me. The merging with the infinite is also speeding up at the same rate. And there arose in me that following day just a thought that said, well, you have a choice, Jonathan. You can cross over fully and completely, leave this body completely behind, or not. You have a choice. And that was surprising to me that would arise in my mind at all. It also was a fascinating question because it's the peace that passes all understanding is a very, in which there's no suffering of any kind. and a complete release from fear of any kind, and which seems to contain absolutely everything and all in an infinite manner without any lack, want, or need, which sounds suspiciously like what a lot of religions describe as heaven. Asking a question like, well, why wouldn't you want to go that way? Is an interesting question. And so it was surprising to me that in my mind at that time, when that choice presented itself, there also arose something in me that said, I think I'm not done here yet. I think I might not go. I think I'm going to stay. And it's real close. Like I could, 51% stay, 49% go. It's really close, but I think I need to do some stuff here first. And that even evoked another thought in this, 29-year-old mind of mine, which was, I don't know what to do here anyways. What am I doing here? I mean, I feel this impulse like there's some things to do, but I don't even know what they are. I really don't. Maybe I'll figure it out. Maybe I'll find out. But I think I'm going to choose not to go through that doorway. We're now in the second day. It hasn't wavered in any way whatsoever. It's essentially deepening over that time.
Oh,
Because as more of that life force falls away, the merging into the infinite is equally increasing. It lasted until my father took me to the emergency room at the hospital 2 hours away. I've actually said nothing to him. He has no idea that my body is dying, nor does he have any idea that I'm experiencing merging into the infinite. But that second day, he arrives and says something looks like something's off. And but when he says that to me, I think, well, all right, we'll go back to the hospital. I guess I'll stay. And so that's the choice. And so when he comes in the room and says, let's go back to the hospital, I think, all right, I guess that's what we're doing. I'll stay. And as we make this 2 hour drive, and I'm actually in a fantastic mood, like a joyful mood. I can barely speak again, physically, that with the what's been done to the throat and all these things, it's difficult to speak, and I don't much, but I'll eke out a whispered word, and I'm in a fabulous mood, actually. We go back to the hospital. They confirm that my body is dying when we get there, and it's dying for the stupidest reason in all of medical science. My body is dying and shutting down from dehydration. And this is also the first moment in which my father realizes, because some doctor tells him that I'm, dying. And so he's quite happy to come to a hospital. It's also a very simple fix. So they poke an IV bag of saline solution into my arm, begin to drain it into my body. And the instant that saline solution is connected, I feel that life force beginning to flow back in, and that merging with the infinite also begins to reverse. You had asked earlier, was it life-changing? The direct consequence was it turned me into a spiritual seeker in a way I don't think I could possibly have been before. But outwardly, it changed nothing at first. And the reason for that is that I could not reconcile it. I knew what I knew. I'd seen what I'd seen. I'd experienced what I'd experienced. I knew what it was like to recognize clearly that this body was an illusion, that the deepest seat of my own being could not possibly be contained by the limitation of this physical body, and knew that even that individuated sense of self that was outside of the limitations of a body that was also something of an illusion, and that individuatedness was like an idea that was itself also not true, and that the even more fundamental truth beyond that was that sense of beingness couldn't be contained by a self, that it was ultimately really no different in any way, nor divorced from in any way this all-encompassing wholeness. But when you wake up in the morning and you're late for work and you have to fight through traffic and eat a breakfast burrito in your car, it's easy to forget those things, or it's easy to at least set them aside. I couldn't figure out how to reconcile that kind of experience, that kind of awareness with being late for work. And so it turned me inward into very privately into a seeker in which I sought this question of like, well, how does any of this make sense? How does this really relate to this world and to this way that I've thought of myself? Like, and when I'm running to work, I feel like this body is very important and that all of its activities are very important. And how can I understand that the opposite of that was true in a near-death experience, but seems very important now? What's the truth? How does that square up? And so, as far as the outside world is concerned, what I did was bury this experience in myself because I couldn't figure out how to square it up. And over the next, slightly over a decade, encountered such an array of other experiences, some of them including death and dying, some of them including, wildly unexpected spiritual experiences, uh, that forced me back in touch with this experience and forced me to reconcile over and over. And and sometimes I struggle to figure out, which of those stories to continue with, frankly. But um, the 10 years later, for instance, my father has died, and I meet him in a hospital bed and have a shared death experience. I didn't know it was even called that until recently. um, in which I got to meet with him, and language really does struggle to encompass these things, but the best way I can describe it is that he and I met each other you could say on an energetic level or a spirit level or a soul level, and literally joined together. I often think of it as a mind level. Um, and it was as though I got to meet him in his otherwise unconscious, failing body, plugged into machines, and meet him in fullness, on that sort of soul level or spirit level, and walk with him to the edge of that infinity and show it to him in a way that's so beautiful I can hardly express, and say to him, let me show you where you're going. Let me walk you to it. And sat there on the edge and looked into that infinite with him for hours, um, and knowing full well that in a very short period of time, he was going to take one more step into it, and I was going to stay here. And that there's no way I could have walked him to that place without having known it already myself. I knew the way. Um, and so you can imagine it's experiences like that again forced me back into my own experience to reconcile with my own experience. There were other occasions when I encountered some, unexpected, really quite major physical pain. The details are honestly not that important, but that those are moments that force me back into this experience as well. Like, wait a minute, I know what the difference between suffering and pain are. So, in one of those cases, it actually began with a um, sort of fighting off this physical pain for quite a while, a solid, day and a half. And there was something about having to deal with really intense pain that forced me inside. And this outrageous experience occurred, but it was an experience that was so harkened back to the NDE experience, in which the first thing that arose was like this box inside me cracked open, and what I actually had was what you might call a life review, but it was the worst possible face of it. It was like it was every kind of pain that I had ever experienced in this life, physical pain, emotional pain, and every kind of pain, just sort of cracked open and was seen and experienced simultaneously in one moment, which was horrifying, of course, and it made me completely break down. And then it merged, that morphed into an experience that is so difficult to put into words, but we're going to do it anyway, which is that it felt as though the experience was that this mind of mine, which had contained all this memory and contained all this experience, merged with what felt like all the minds that, what do we got? 7 billion people on the planet. And the experience was simply that this mind was a fragment of that whole, and it lost its individuality for a moment and essentially merged with all those other 8 billion or whatever we have, and which presented itself as the fundamental truth, actually, that, but again, it was the worst possible face of it. And it was the experience of the collective suffering of 8 billion souls simultaneously. And that was a level of absolute overwhelm and breakdown that is of a magnitude I absolutely simply cannot put into words. If you saw what was happening to me in the room at the time, it looked like I was having a seizure, and like shrieking and guttural and bawling, and like the greatest kind of emotional overwhelm that you could possibly see in a human being. That's also how it was being experienced, and it was essentially horrifying in a way, but it got my quite a while goes by, it subsides, and I'm just shell shocked from the experience of what it was like for that individuated sense of self to dissolve again. But how is that possible? It's like I couldn't have gone there if I didn't already know that pathway. That collective suffering eventually shows itself to have been as much an illusion, and I'm going to try to unpack that a little more. But first, there's this illusion of separation that merges into this wholeness, and the collective suffering of mankind presents itself as having been what I can best describe as a misthought, a mistaken thought. I spend the next day just really shell shocked by the experience and trying to unpack it myself. Like, oh my God, how do I, what do I do with this? And the following day is sort of, this experience arises that's sort of like the answer. I mean, it was almost like the divine was like, Jonathan, here's the problem. Here's literally collective human pain and suffering. Boom, there you go. The following day is an experience that is a return in many ways to that wholeness in which pain and suffering is literally impossible, and that there is nothing but perfect peace, a lack of fear. There couldn't possibly be anything lacking, wanting, or needed in any way, and essentially nothing but lovingness. As I'm trying to unpack that, the phrase that arises in my mind, like, how do I make sense of this and connect the dots, is 3 simple words. And not to put too fine a point on it, but this is one of the ways, one of the pathways one can take to literally transcend human suffering. And those 3 words were: give up judgment. There's a great deal to unpack in that, but I would say I spent the next many, many years trying to understand what that meant. In any case, if I tried to put the shortest possible amount of words on it, it would be along the lines of, it's our faculty of judgment that is integral to the misthought. It's in that judgment that we strengthen separation ideas rather than dissolve them and move towards something that is more whole and complete and without the separation. At the time, though, it's again for me, it's a period of just absolute mind blownness. Like, wait a minute, what do I do with this? How do I go back to the office? And who cares actually if I go back to the office? Uh, Increasingly, I don't, and um, and it's through these kinds of things that over. And this did take quite a period of years, but I end up becoming so taken in by these kinds of experiences that so many just ordinary aspects of life just seem less and less important. And uh, to the point that eventually I do this thing you sometimes hear about in spiritual stories, and I give up on all of it, and I actually walk away completely from ordinary life, and I say goodbye to the lovely woman I'm with. I sell my car. I give the keys to my home to someone I barely know. Uh, and I I disappear on a very long self-directed solo retreat for months, and and I try to unpack all these things. It's there during that retreat that I for me the sort of most final shift came, the most life changing, the most life altering shift took root. And one of the things that's at the heart of all these experiences, and I can easily go back to the NDE in it, was that in that dissolution of the sense of a separate self, it's shown that that sense of self, that individuated sense of self, is essentially a thought construct, and there's an illusoriness to it. There's a falseness to it. And over these many intervening years, I had run into that one in particular. There had been moment of thousands and thousands of times I had looked inward and thought, well, where is that sense of self? What is that sense of self? What is this thing that seems to drive me and be this self? And whenever I would look, I couldn't find it. I could not pinpoint it exactly. Where is it? Is it here? Is it there? I can't find it right there, and yet I still feel it exists. Where is it? Is it over here? No, it's not there either. And there was this looking for it over 1,000 times and not quite finding it. And there began to settle in this awareness that it was in fact a false construct, and that's why you couldn't find it. When I began to sort of revel in that in a way that was similar to that NDE long before. And it began to be associated with a kind of peace that I also couldn't put into words most of the time. And it was that peace that sometimes that peace would come and find me. Sometimes I could seem to cozy up to it myself. Sometimes I couldn't find it at all. And it's sort of this experience sort of wavered in and out over many, many years. But it was during this time of retreat in which it felt as though something in me actually collapsed. Some construct in me actually collapsed, that the awareness of that lack of an individuated self being a real thing kind of collapsed for good. And that is what's never wavered since. And so that's a way of saying that peace settled in that during that time, during that shift, in a way that's never wavered since. That's true. And that is the most life-changing shift I've gone through. It was far greater than the shift from the NDE itself many years before. That NDE was like a signpost. Like, here's the way to go. This is what you're heading towards. But there's a lot to do first. There's a lot to understand, a lot of other experiences that you need, that you must have to really fully understand what took place here. It was many years later that NDE really fully made sense.
Wow. It seems like you had a really deep realization, because, in the Hindus and many spiritual paths say that this reality is an illusion. And they also
Yes.
say that the self is an illusion. And they call it Maya, at least the Hindus. and also Buddhists.
Hmm.
And regarding everything you learned throughout these years, I know that you presently teach what you call healing by divine principle.
Mm,
So is that derived from everything you learned?
it is. And it was also wildly unexpected. So in going through the shift that I was just describing, some other things kind of arose out of that had never been really a part of my experience in the past. And I'm sure you've probably heard stories like this many times, but it was in going through that sort of final doorway that it was shocking to experience that all of a sudden there was a capacity in me that opened up for a greater intuitive knowing of things, to a great um, to a degree that was startling to me. It took some getting used to. It became clear that in many cases, not always, but often, it was possible to share the piece that I've been describing and share a touch of the experience I've been describing with others. And that happens a lot of different ways. But in what unfolded in this case, one of the ways that could be shared, and it still seems kind of wild to me, even now, it's still today, was by quieting down with someone, having a quiet moment with them, and putting my hand on their head and being completely silent with them for a few moments. And what would seem to arise was that some touch of the experience I'm describing would sort of rise up within them, and they would experience it in some way that was meaningful to them and understandable to them and accessible to them. And that's very different for every single person. But out of a lot of those experiences came something that they would describe themselves as very healing. Sometimes it was physical healing, sometimes it was psycho-spiritual healing, sometimes it was more sort of amorphous than that, and just was an experience for them that was deeply, deeply peaceful in a way that they was rare for them. And that there was something about that was simply very, very, very sweet. So, and again, all of this took, for me, it took quite a while to get used to. But what I would, the reason I called it healing by divine principle was that in those kinds of moments, it was easier to describe what I wasn't doing than what I was doing. And that's because in that moment, the only call that I have in any way is to go quietly inward to that experience in which there is no sense of self at all. And to me, it's absolutely automatic and natural. There's no effort in that. It's just sort of automatically always there. I just merely direct my consciousness, towards it. It's always sort of either in the background or in the foreground or somewhere in between. But all I have to do is direct the awareness to it. But let's be very clear then that what I've actually just said, which is it's sitting for a moment in the very full awareness that sense of individuated self does not have any actual truth. And so it's like revisiting that overarching wholeness. It's revisiting that all-encompassing allness. And if that's so, then there is no personal will here to be directing anything. And so I am not. Am I praying? No, I'm not directing energy. I'm not checking in on Akashic records. I'm not talking to angels. I'm not doing Reiki. I'm not um, talking to guides. It is just a simple dissolution into the overwhelming allness in which there is no sense of lack or want or need. And in that way, it's impossible for there to seem as though there is something broken or even needs fixing. And so that's what I mean in saying it's more like a description of what I am not doing. And so again, some aspect of that wholeness tends to sort of rise up in this person in a way that makes sense for them. And so it is often a kind of healing experience for them. it and in addition to everything I just said, and this still continues to surprise me, there are times when out of that stillness does come other kinds of intuitive information that arises here on this side. And so, sometimes we can talk about that, and that becomes a part of their healing experience. But in essence, my role is to sit down quietly with them and then get completely out of the way and let what I can only describe as the divine arise in them in whatever way it can show itself to them.
This is a indirect consequence of your NDE, right? Because basically you've been dealing with this feeling of wholeness or oneness throughout your life.
I can actually look back to the younger part of my life before the NDE. I mean, I was otherwise living a very conventional life in many ways with a very ordinary framework. I didn't, but I can look back to, moments as a little kid and moments as a teenager where there were some ways in which a little bit of these things were touched. So there's a way in which I think the NDE was not really just the beginning. I think it was just a really powerful signpost along the way. I can think back to some of those experiences as a child, and the simplest way to put it was that I discovered as a little kid lying in bed at night, awake, with nothing to do and kind of bored, and all I could do was entertain myself with the contents of my own mind. And I discovered that there was a way in which I could sort of take what I thought of as a backward step inside my mind. And it was as though I could leave my personality out front a little bit and step back from it and realize that there was something about that took me into the awareness I could only describe later. Like I didn't have the words for it at the time, but it might be, I think it's sort of the first time that I was consciously aware that it was possible to step back into an aware consciousness that was apart from that, not only apart from that body, but apart from the personality, apart from all the things that I thought made me me. And, as a little kid, I didn't have any words for that. It was just a kind of an interesting curiosity. I didn't experience it as something mystical or spiritual or anything. It was just sort of a thing of an awareness I could sort of play with until I fell asleep. And I didn't think anything of it. And I really didn't think anything of it until many, many years later, when I would look back on it and go, oh, I do kind of remember touching something of this long ago as a child, actually. So I do. I think this life has been a journey towards this kind of understanding, kind of from the beginning. And I couldn't have imagined it. I had no religious background that was particularly meaningful. I had never studied with teachers. There weren't gurus. There was no spiritual communities. There was nothing of the sort. Everything I'm describing was something that I kept extremely private, extremely internal. That was just my nature. I wouldn't have known who to speak to anyways. By the time, it wasn't until my 30s, until after the NDE, that I began to look into spiritual literature a bit to help me understand my own experiences. And yeah, there were some things that were sort of helpful. There were things that were helpful along the way there, but really, it's just been an experience-based kind of journey, and most of which was unexpected. One of the ways that I end up working with people often is, we could say, it's simply bringing them a little bit more to an experience of this universalness. And it's through those kinds of experiences that they recognize that it has been with them always and forever, eternally, that it is what they are. And it's not something that they gain. It's not something that they achieve. It's just the falling away of the illusions that reveals what's always been eternally and always. And that's not an act of penance. It's not an act of worthiness. It's not, it's just, it's a change in mind. It's a change in perspective. And it has more to do with relinquishing the blocks and relinquishing what is not true, and recognizing that often there's this process of having to let go of beliefs that reveal themselves, and we let them go easily and naturally when we see them for what they are, which were untrue. When you see something, when someone recognizes unequivocally, I mean, it's a silly example, but when a little kid begins to recognize that Santa Claus isn't real, it becomes literally impossible to believe in him anymore. And so sometimes we play at believing in it, but in our heart of hearts, we know that it's not true. But it becomes literally impossible to believe something is true when you know unequivocally that it isn't. And that's one way of describing the spiritual journey and the spiritual, growth, if you will. It's relinquishing what is untrue. And that often involves a life path that it requires you to examine a lot of those old beliefs. Many of them end up being held in a way that's so old and so buried that we've sort of forgotten even that we hold particular beliefs. They've become to seem like facts, not beliefs, just because they've been with us for so long. And sometimes the process has to do with uncovering the fact that somewhere buried in there was actually a choice. And that's not only an act of beginning to relinquish it, it's also an act of what you might call, in popular parlance these days, the real seat of taking back one's own power. And it's that power of choice, it's that power of choosing that begins to allow these layers to fall away, to reveal what's always been eternally true.
You have a website called Assist the Spirit, right?
Anyone can reach out to me at assistthespirit.com, and there's articles I've written, and a handful of videos, and I'll pop a link to this podcast up there and things like that. And so there's a bunch of resources for, if any of this resonates with anyone, you'll find other things there on the website that would be surely of interest and just general support. I spent most of all these years saying absolutely nothing. That was sort of my natural default setting. And I would even go back to that experience in the NDE in which there was no impulse to say anything. Because why would there be an impulse if there was no need for anything to change and everything was completely all right the way it was, and there was no lack or want or need? There's a way in which it's very natural not to say anything. And in fact, when I went through that sort of final doorway during this long retreat, the fact is I barely spoke out loud for over a year, which is a kind of a strange way to be a grown-up in this modern world. But that's what felt right and reasonable and natural. And so I just didn't. And over the years since then, it simply became somehow relevant that it was time to speak up a bit and to be of use and be useful. So these days I do that by having lovely conversations like this with you today. What a joy. And when people want to come to me and work one-on-one, I do that. Sometimes people invite me to come talk to their group and things like that, and I love doing that. So I travel around a lot when I can. I can't really think of anything else to be doing on this planet at all that would be a better use of my time than these kinds of things. And so it seems like the natural direction. So reach out to me. Come to assistthespirit.com, poke around, see what you think. And anyone's welcome. You are welcome to this table.
This has been the A.J. Parr Spiritual Journalist Podcast. Please like, share, and subscribe.